Hello, I'm Abilash Jaikumar, co-founder and managing director of TresVista. On today's TresVista talk, I have the pleasure of being joined by an exceptional group of panelists to discuss digitization of private equity platforms. We have a great mix of LP, GP, and private equity-backed operating companies. So I would love for my panelists to introduce themselves. Lee, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Hello, Lee Senderov. I'm the Chief Revenue and Digital Officer at Foundation Partners Group. Foundation Partners Group is the second largest provider of funeral and cremation services in the United States, and we are an Access Holdings portfolio company. I've spent the last 15 years of my career disrupting antiquated business models and transforming businesses to take advantage of new paradigms, and excited to be here to talk about this today.
Thank you, Lee. Michael?
Great, hi, Mike Schreiber. I'm the CEO and founder of Playfly Sports. We're also an Access Holdings portfolio company. Our business is focused on driving media and marketing for sports organizations. So we work with pro teams, baseball, NBA, hockey. We work with college athletic departments. We also work with high school status athletic associations, in addition to esports teams. So all across the full sports ecosystem to help support them from a marketing and media perspective. My background has historically been in media, entertainment, and sports my whole career, but my role has mostly been focused on digital transformation. So taking some of the traditional media and converting it and packaging it up for distribution over new platforms and for new consumption habits.
Thank you. Nitin?
Hi, this is Nitin Gupta. I'm with Flexstone Partners. Flexstone is a private equity fund. We have offices in New York, Geneva, Paris, and in Singapore. And across all the geographies, we focus on mostly middle market investments across funds, co-investments, as well as secondaries. We manage about $10 billion.
Thank you. And Nick?
All right. Hi, Nick Kapauan, principal with Access Holdings. A little bit about Access. So we're Baltimore-based private equity fund, just over $2 billion in assets under management. I'm excited to be here with our partners at FBG, Playfly, and Nitin at Flexstone. Yes, a little bit about myself. So prior to Access, I was as a consultant at McKinsey for 6 years, and before that, I was an AI developer at IBM. So pleasure to be on the panel.
Maybe to start off, I'd love to talk about the top of the capital funnel, where it starts with the LPs flowing before it flows to GPs and flowing on to the portfolio companies. When you talk about digitization, there's been a lot of evolution in how private equity firms themselves operate. And there's been a lot of news for the biggest GPs out there in how they've invested in technology and transformed themselves, driven by what the LPs want. So, maybe to start us off, it'd be great, Nitin or Nick, if you can talk about how do you think about digitization as far as a tool for creating alpha for fund managers? And what are the things you're seeing?
Yeah, so I guess first we need to kind of talk about like what is digital? How do we find digital? So, I mean, it's an umbrella term, right? You could think about phrases like agile, industry 4.0, customer experience. There's a lot of different ways that you can talk about digital, but when it comes to private equity.
Oh, I think we've lost Nick. Nitin, maybe you want to pick up where you left off?
Sure. So the way we look at digital is actually in the simplest way, right? The term, you kind of have different degrees of digital. I mean, you can go from the basic use of technology for everyday functions, right, which is pretty much used by everyone now, to bringing technology into more processes or functions across the organization, and we're seeing that more on a piecemeal manner. To some firms are really transforming the way they really do business, right, in a holistic way, where every function, everything is sort of this digital transformation, and it's interacting with everyone. The technologies are interacting with each other, and it really increases efficiency across the organization. And it's a way for companies to help grow as well as to realize their full potential. So it's really kind of embracing technology. I mean, in terms of the latter, right, it creates a lot of value, but it also requires a greater buy-in from across the organization, and it really is a change in the mindset and how you do business. And we're seeing more and more private equity, not only private equity GPs, but on the LP side, and also just being implemented throughout the portfolio companies now.
Great. So speaking more, Nitin, about digitization of private equity specifically, there is a big difference between the mega funds like the Blackstones of the world and middle market firms, which actually constitute the majority of private equity firms out there. What are some of the differences in approach to investing in digitization and actually implementing it between a mega fund versus a middle market fund?
Yeah, so I'd say, funds that are operating at a smaller scale, right, may find this exercise, maybe they think that it's more expensive, or maybe they realize fewer benefits just because their portfolio is not as large. But at the same time, it might be much easier to implement across the organization and because it requires less buy-in. On the larger end, we're sort of seeing, because of their broader scale and the number of investments, they may find this undertaking to have a significant amount of benefits because you can cross-leverage the information, and there's a lot more synergies across your organization, right? Across the different portfolio companies that a private equity fund has. And the costs are less on a unit basis, but it requires, again, a greater buy-in from across the organization of the private equity fund and all of their portfolio companies to really implement this. But there are differences between large and smaller firms, but we are seeing more and more private equity funds embrace this because there are, as we can get into, kind of much more top line and cost synergies that you can really kind of create best practices across the organization and leverage those across the entire portfolio.
Going from the private equity firm now into the operating company, obviously private equity firms themselves are sitting in kind of the middle of this ecosystem. On one side, having demands from LPs to share information with them, but on the other side, making demands of operating companies of the data that they'd want, both from them for informational purposes, but also help to drive operational improvement at the portfolio company level. For Michael and Lee being managers in businesses and obviously being very data driven, how are you seeing that interaction between the companies and their investors, and how much of it is a tension of creating information for investors versus actually creating information to run the business better? Lee, if you'd like to take it.
Sure. I mean, I think they go hand in hand, right? Because at the end of the day, we answer to our constituents, one of which is obviously our investors, and it goes hand in hand. Sometimes it does become a large undertaking, and so we need to really have organization around our data analytics teams as we grow to be able to provide our investors with the right information. But a lot of times what comes out of those analysis helps us make better business decisions. So in that respect, yes, there's a bit of a tension because it's obviously added work, but at the same time, it also helps us become better managers and operators of our own business.
Michael, your perspective would be interesting because you might say your business is digitally native, right? It's the core of what you do. Can you talk about how you think about digital transformation for your business being a newer entity?
Sure. Yeah, so we use data in a number of different ways, and really both from a business perspective as part of our product, as well as from a learning perspective and then interaction with our investors. But just at a starting point, we really transact on the value of fandom in sports, and at the end of the day, the more fans, the highly engaged those fans are, the better it is for the sports organizations we work for, the advertisers who we supply media for. All of those elements are really driven off of that fandom. So trying to organize that fandom in a way that can be positioned for example, for sales purposes, sponsorship and advertising sales purposes, we need to organize that data in a way that allows us to really cut and slice all the different elements of fandom. So fan data for us is a big category, and we transact on that data. So how many fans are watching, how many fans are interacting, how long do they interact? All of those elements are key data for us in terms of all the transactions that we're involved in. So we need to be able to not only predict it in advance, but then report it afterwards for each event that happens, whether it's a live event, whether it's a on-air event or a digital event. We need to be able to have the pre and the post. We then take that data and we organize it and focus on data hygiene for our own business to be able to see fan data across our different sports partners and be able to utilize that data and those databases to be able to create intelligence for us for our business overall, not only getting new clients and new sports organizations as customers, but also helping launch and think about new businesses in the sports space. And then on the back side of that, of course, we utilize all of that data to come back and report back our performance back to our investor at Access Holdings. So we're pretty much, heavily in the data usage space, both for all the way from the front end to our product, all the way to the back end in terms of our reporting to our lead investor at Access.
The relationship between the LP and the GP, and what does digitization really mean for the private equity firm, and how do you use digitization for creating alpha as a fund manager?
Yeah, and I guess there's a couple ways to answer that. It's digital, how we engage with our LPs. There's digital in how we actually improve our own processes as looking at our fund as a company itself. How do we improve our own internal processes through automation, especially with digital? And the third piece is how do we actually use digital for value creation at our portfolio companies? And kind of the opportunities are a big set of opportunities, as you can imagine, across all those three different categories. But like I was saying when I dropped off, that digital is a very broad umbrella term. Digitization, whatever you can call it. Talking about customer experience, talking about cloud, talking about digital use cases, Industry 4.0. It's an umbrella term that covers a lot of different things. I think kind of the three big areas, though, that I focus on when it comes to digital. So the first piece is around data and analytics. I heard you guys were talking about data and analytics when I came back on. It's the amount of data being generated kind of in the world right now is incredible. I think the stat I heard is every day we generate as much data as that we have as a human race since the dawn of civilization, like 2005 or something. It's being generated every day, and it's not just phones and laptops and things. It's devices. Your fridge, your car, like everything's generating video cameras. I think if you're in London, your face is caught on video camera like 300 times a day or something. So the amount of data being generated and the amount of the capabilities to analyze that data, intelligence, machine learning, vision, such is incredible. So data and analytics is a big one. How do we actually speed up decision making, better decisions faster using data? And then now to answer your specific question, the way that applies to us as a private equity company is, we're trying to use data to inform our investment approach as much as possible. So at Access, we take a very thesis-driven approach to investing. So we form very strong perspectives on the specific spaces you want to invest in. Take something like residential services, for example. We want to participate in areas in residential services that have optimal supply demand conditions that we're excited about, has the optimal level of fragmentation where we can kind of pick regional markets that we want to play in. How do we use data to find those specific opportunities in specific markets we want to play in? So one of the things that we've done at Access is start putting together data cubes, things like we've done this for about 2,000 different industry segments that we have an idea that we want to participate in, putting together data cubes on things like fragmentation, top players, total addressable market, number of sites, catchment area facilities, average wage rates of laborers in that industry to get a degree, to get a sense of how specialized it is. So building these data cubes so we can rapidly prioritize what spaces fit within Access's kind of investment criteria, and doing it in a really rapid kind of high leverage way versus the alternative of people actually doing the research, desktop research, and doing it themselves. So it really lets you do things rapidly when you could kind of deploy those analyze those giant sets of data. So digital analytics is the first piece. The second piece I'd say is digital kind of a stakeholder experience, and this is relevant to the LP side. So how do you use digital channels to improve stakeholder experience? So is this, you know, a digital LP portal that you can use, that LPs can use to view, you know, real-time fund performance without having to pull that from the team. When you apply that to our portfolio companies, you know, digital customer experience, you know, how do we improve our customer experience using digital channels, you know, e-commerce, things like that. So that's another big component under this digital umbrella. And then the third piece, I think, and this is the last part of the question, the third piece is cloud and distributed computing, the other big component, I think, because the ability to do, you know, 1 and 2 that I just talked about is so much easier these days, just with the ecosystem of providers, not just like the super scalar kind of platforms, Google's, Amazon's, Microsoft's of the world, but just this ecosystem of services that companies build on top of that you can just rapidly assemble, you know, these digital products, both for even in the private equity space. You know, there's a lot of bespoke solutions already for LP tracking and fund performance tracking and everything to our portfolio companies. ERP, CRM systems, building a website, like everything has this ecosystem of providers out there that could kind of rapidly stand up these digital capabilities. So yeah, so broadly, just go back to your question, how do we think about digital in terms of fund and portfolio performance? It's about data analytics to drive decision making better. It's about improving your stakeholder experience, whether that's customers of your portfolio or whether it's your LPs within for a fund. And it's, you know, rapidly being able to do that using kind of this ecosystem of technologies that are already out there.
Great. Lee, I'd like to follow up with you. Whereas Michael's running a digitally native type of business where their entire business model relies on data and digitization, you're more experienced with transformation, and you're currently in an industry that's been around for a long time, and there's a lot of different challenges when you're trying to change practices. Can you maybe speak to some of those challenges and how you get over them in transforming a business?
Sure. I think there are a few things to keep in mind. So one is sort of something that Nick alluded to. This digital and transformation are really big words. And so, it really depends on what type of transformation you're going through. But in terms of pitfalls that I've seen is, number one, you need to have an owner over this transformation. If you think it's going to be somebody's 10% of their job and you're going to transform a business, it won't happen. A lot of companies make this mistake. They say, oh, you know what, I'll just give it to Lee, I'll just give it to Abi, and he'll do it on the side. Not gonna work, right? So I think actually having an owner who's responsible for leading this is super important. I think the second thing is realizing that you need to get everyone in the organization to buy in, or at least the vast majority of the organization to buy in. And this is really a cultural shift more than a technology shift. And I think that's often not thought about. I'll give you an example. When we were looking to put video customer chat in my last company, I was running a jewelry organization within Berkshire Hathaway. And you think, oh, video chat for customer service reps, easy technology, not a hard technology to implement at all. But you think about all the change management that has to come along with that. Customer service reps have to be willing to be on video 8 hours a day. They have to have an environment that's conducive to video. There are all of these other cultural challenges to overcome when doing that sort of transformation. I would say last but not least, if you're really serious about a transformation, it's a complete shift in DNA and the way that you think about your whole organization. I think Nitin touched on this before. It's not one isolated thing. It's, okay, what is this business going to look like in 10 years? How are we going to service our customers? How are we going to service our vendors? How are we going to play in our ecosystem? Where are we today? And then ultimately, what is the path to getting there? What is that journey that we all have to get on? And some of it is technology, some of it is change management, some of it is culture. It's really holistic.
Nitin, I'd like to ask you about your perspective as an LP. PE firms face increasing pressure from investors around getting more information, having greater transparency, and improving the data granularity. But for the most part, as an industry, especially in middle market, most PE firms aren't considering creating a digital plan before entering and exiting investments currently. How do LPs approach digitization while diligent fund managers, and what are the low-hanging fruit as far as digital solutions that PE firms can adopt to accelerate portfolio value creation and enhance the performance of their assets?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two parts to it, right? One is kind of the GP's perspective and the LP's perspective, and sort of, you know, because we invest in many private equity funds, you know, some GPs do it great, others are still kind of getting up to speed. I think Access, quite frankly, does a really amazing job on technology and how they're implemented it across all of their portfolio companies, right? So traditionally, what we've seen in private equity, right, is private equity funds kind of leverage their prior experiences in an industry or operating partners or their network of executives to create value, and they bring a lot of value to the board level. But now we're sort of, given where the valuations are in the industry and given the intense competition for deals, some of the better GPs are really leveraging that technology to really look at what are the various levers they can pull post-investment to really help these companies grow and really lower the potential going in valuation of these companies, right? So you're looking at, so some of the GPs are using a lot of technology like Access does, right, in terms of sourcing deals and in terms of getting out to these proprietary deals, so you're not paying those crazy multiples on companies at in the auction process, or helping these companies do a lot more add-on acquisitions, right? The other ways is to really look at what are the key revenue drivers across these companies and what sort of things you can pull, and on the cost structure. So the more granularity you have on the companies and where they're actually making money and what are the total costs within those companies, you sort of start to really look at other things, right? Other things come up to say, okay, maybe I can save money on this product as well, or this side as well, this process. So there's a lot of different ways that sort of once you start implementing it, right, other things come up. It's sort of a flywheel effect to that from a GP's perspective. And aside from that, right, it also helps the GP, and this is where I'll get into the LP side, it helps them to better communicate where they really are adding value. And that's really important to us when we look at things as an LP side, right? Because the private equity field, particularly in the middle market, is so crowded. And you know, if you listen to enough pitches, they all start to sound pretty much the same in terms of what private equity funds do. And so, and on top of that, if you look at fund returns over a period of time, right, repeat performance in private equity seems to be coming down. So it's harder to continue to replicate and create top quartile returns. So it's become very hard for an LP when we are evaluating a GP, right, to say which one is good or not. The other piece that's adding the complexity to this is that many private equity funds are coming back to market at a quicker pace. And so there's a lot of unrealized companies in their portfolio. So typically when you've looked at, let me look at the ROI and the IRRs of a private equity fund, that starts to become a little less relevant because you really need to dig down into the portfolio companies and see how they're performing. So when you have more data from the GP, right, it allows us to really drill down into the portfolio and one, see where do they actually add value, what happened to this company pre and post investment, and to be able to really quantify it, right, to see how much value is driven by the GP versus just multiple expansion or just because the overall industry is good. And like I said, I mean, just given the high level of unrealized companies in the portfolio, that's really important. The other piece that becomes really relevant for us is, listen, we're living in an interconnected world, right? Where all of these different complexities are there. You know, when we had the COVID crisis, there was a huge push by our own LPs and for us to really figure out how is this impacting each of our investments, right? Each of the GPs that we're invested in. Today it's the Ukraine crisis, right? Where everyone wants to know, well, what does that have? What impact does that have on the portfolio? What impact inflation has on the portfolio? So the quicker that we can get that level of information from our GPs, it allows us to then communicate that to our own LPs and to really position their portfolio in terms of what type of capital calls there might be, right, over the coming quarter or two, what type of distributions where there might be, or what do they need to reserve in our own LPs portfolios because of these complexities in the portfolio. So I think that more and more of this type of analytics that are being used at the portfolio company level is easier for us to really grasp what impact the macro environment has on a GP's portfolio.
One of the keys to reporting data is gathering data. And Michael, you kind of touched upon the different parts of the data value chain within your own business. And kind of the way I think about it is there's 3 stages. You have descriptive data analytics, predictive data analytics, and prescriptive data analytics. And each of these is a different part of the value chain, but quite often the lowest hanging fruit is just the descriptive, just capturing data and organizing it. So data engineering is a big part of the lift. Michael and Lee, both from an operating perspective, when you think about digitalization, how much energy and effort spent in each of those phases, in the descriptive, the predictive, and the prescriptive?
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks for the question. So for us, it's we probably spend. Well, it depends on our different businesses. So, for example, we use so we have data around events and venues, which comes with a certain type of data. And then we have data around TV viewing. So, and how many people watch a sporting event on TV, which comes with a different set of data. So, and then we'll actually have fan survey data that we build and acquire, which asks about the team and about your engagement with the team. So we combined all of those different buckets. So we'll get in-venue data, we'll get viewership data, and we'll get fan survey information and triangulate it to be useful. So from our perspective, so we really invest in all of those different categories. When it comes to activating on the data, we actually put all of those feeds into a data warehouse, which then gives us the ability to profile fans and be able to use that information. So to give an example, actual advertisers who want to find fans who are not only fans of a certain team, but also have an intention to buy a truck, we can help them get to those fans via our profiles from an activation perspective, and then we can actually target those fans with the advertisements. So it's really, we use all 3 different categories in 3 different ways. I wouldn't even know if I say how much time do we spend or investment do we spend in each of those categories, but because that's all really fully integrated into our business. But it all depends on the platform. So whether it's a live event, broadcast event, visual event, whether it's and then what the outcome we're trying to create for our partner, whether it's a sports organization trying to market and get more fans, whether it's a advertiser trying to address a certain category of fans to be in front of during a sporting event. Those all have different flavors for us. But there is another whole category that we do tap into when it comes to what we do, and that is at the end of the day, we also have a CRM tool that we use in terms of working with all of our sports organizations. So as an example, we work with all major baseball teams in the MLB and basketball teams in the NBA and hockey teams in the NHL. So we actually have a tool on our end that also manages our interactions with the team, our clients, versus data from the fans. So a whole nother layer of data and management and CRM tools that we utilize, some which we tap into actually from Access and their Access Lead Lab, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
And Lee, from your perspective, where data isn't directly tied to the product, but drives management decision making, what do you think about the different stages of data and digitization?
Sure. So I think just like many portfolio companies and private equity companies, we are made up of 215 different funeral homes and crematories across the country, right? Because this is a buy and build strategy to combine these funeral homes. So we spend a significant amount of time on that first bucket, which is really gathering and grouping the data so that it's all streamlined so we can make sense of it. Because individually, one single funeral home on average services 150 families a year. There's not that much data that's going to allow you to become prescriptive or predictive from that. So really the beauty of this is getting all of this data combined under one umbrella in one warehouse, and then to be able to sort it in a way that allows you to make predictive or prescriptive business decisions. So we spent a lot of time, I would say the first year I was here, we spent a lot of time grouping all of this data together. And now we are at the point where it is organized and we're able to make decisions out of it. And we're also able to inform things like which markets should we go and acquire additional funeral homes in? How do we think about which ads to bid on Google and which ones not to bid on, which keywords to bid on, which ones not to bid on? I think some of this is really the beauty of this practice is really being able to bring all of these small mom and pop businesses under one umbrella and leverage the data across all of them to make decisions that an individual funeral home could never make on their own because they just wouldn't have the amount of data that we have. And this is something that's really applicable in for a lot of private equity companies that purchase these more mom and pop service oriented businesses and group them together. I think this is really where the efficiencies and the values can be driven from.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to note where you talked about the first year at the organization you spent just organizing data. I think that's important to note because often people take for granted the effort and the time it takes to set up a succeeding digital strategy. And a lot of businesses have historical data, but it's not in a format where it's useful. So either you can spend the energy and effort to go backwards and engineer that data so you can use it, or you set a strategy in place today to capture data going forward so that sometime in the future you'll have a reliable set of data for which you can make predictions and then thereafter prescriptions. Our own data intelligence group, this is what we spend most of our time doing, working with the portfolio companies of private equity firms, specifically for this data engineering activity. Maybe Nick talking about Access Labs, you can talk about what are the different roles within data science. People talk about data science and data scientists, but it's not one person. There are many different skill sets that are required. And Lee, you kind of alluded to just where things might fail is not having someone dedicated to it. But what are the skills that are needed by individuals and from a team perspective to implement a digital transformation strategy?
Is that question for me, Abby?
Yes, why don't you kick it off, Nick?
Yeah, for sure. No, and echo what Lee said. I find in a lot of these transformations, like 80–90% of the work is getting a clean set of aggregate data all together, and then the rest is stuff once you get to analyze it. Descriptive analytics and visualizations and all that stuff you alluded to, Abby. In terms of roles, really, it's I kind of split it between data engineering and data science, right? So on the data engineering side, it's really about setting up the pipes to a modern day pipeline typically has an ingest, transform, and visualize kind of stages. So ingesting the data sets, which could be proprietary data sets, financial data, customer data, product data. You could have public data sets, for some of the Michael referenced all for our digital lead generation platform. So, we're pulling in data from Google, from Google Maps, from ZoomInfo, LinkedIn, Glassdoor, pulling in these public data sets and semi-public data sets, like Facebook, things that you have to acquire. You have to pay for. So it's ingesting all these public, private, semi-public data sets into one place, and then stitching it all together. So it's that transformation part where you have to find correlations between the data. So you can look at, so for example, for our research pipeline, for our front-end research automation tool that I alluded to earlier, it's getting the industry segments, looking at from one data set, mapping that to who are the top 10 companies in that particular industry segment from another data set, cross-referencing those companies with kind of their EBITDA and margins from another data set, pulling in TAM from a fourth data set, then you could kind of calculate market share of the top 5 players. So even though these are all kind of public or semi-public data sets, being able to stitch them all together to get insights across them is valuable because the source data actually is not that proprietary. But anyway, all that to say, kind of ingesting this data, transforming it, stitching it together, storing the transformed data set in a data lake, kind of all that piping to do that is typically a data engineer role to do. And then the data scientist is the one running the algorithms and building visualizations and stuff on top of that data. And then you have your ecosystem, developers, designers that actually productionize this and make front end software on top of the analytics platform. Oh, Abby, I think you're on mute.
And Lee, from your perspective as, in an operating company that's not selling data as a product, and, referring to what you had mentioned previously about having someone take ownership of this process, how do you think about building a team to be able to do this in a non-data business?
Sure. So I think you start with someone who's going to oversee this. I know it sounds obvious, but a lot of times this is missed. But someone who's going to set best practices around data integrity, right? Nick mentioned this too. I think I mentioned it before, gathering the data and understanding where it's coming from and making sure that it has integrity is a huge undertaking and not something to be taken lightly. So someone who's going to oversee that, someone who's going to be able to select the right tools. There are so many different tools out there for different use cases that you really need someone who's an expert to understand, okay, which tool does what. I think also someone who's going to be able to build something that can scale is really important because the data needs never end. They only grow. As an organization grows, more functions build out, more people request data. How does a team like this scale? And there are a variety of different ways to do that. I also think that companies should consider not an in-source or an outsource model, but a combination. We use that today and it works really well. So if you think about your key value drivers, you say, okay, I've got, let's say, 3 key value drivers to my business, and I can't build out a data team to support each one of those value drivers. I'm going to focus on one for the next 2 years and really build a team that understands my M&A capabilities, as an example. At the same time, I've got this other value driver that I'm developing, not quite as developed as the first one, but I still need data analytics for that, but we don't have the core capabilities around marketing data. How do you pull data in from Google and Facebook and make sense of that? So that's something that you can outsource. I think the most important thing with outsourcing is just making sure that there is still an internal stakeholder that understands the mapping, that understands what data is going in and what questions you're trying to answer with the data, so that if you ever do decide to bring it in-house, you're not left with not understanding what was built before. But this is the way we've been approaching it.
Wonderful. It's interesting from our perspective, we have both public equity clients and private equity clients and operating companies. And I would say on the public equity side, they've been ahead of the curve when it comes to ingesting alternative data, which is what Nick was referring to, some of these data sets based on public information or semi-public information or completely private information, but it's testing data sets, do they have integrity, and then driving investment decisions based on that. I think with private equity and operating companies, it's more about how do you drive operating value creation post-investment. But creating these teams, certainly, the most successful teams do have a hybrid approach, and we see that with the clients we work with, the ones who have someone in-house who's taking real charge of the relationship with us is where we can create the most value with our clients. Switching gears a little bit, and another aspect of data and investing is ESG. And ESG is a topic that everyone is discussing these days, and one of the challenges is what does it mean, right? And what does it mean from a data perspective? How do you report ESG? The universe of existing ESG data has a lot of challenges as it relates to the quality, materiality, comparability, and reliability. And often there's not a standardized or audited format to how this data is captured and reported. How can digitalization of PE help standardize and use available data to capitalize on the benefits of ESG-driven investing? And Nick, as a GP, I'd love it if you could address that.
Yeah, I mean, ESG is something that's very important to access, and we asked each of our portfolio companies to target, 3 different ESG commitments that they're making with specific targets that they want to hit, quantitative, that you can measure success or failure. And when I think about kind of using data it's kind of a spectrum from easy to hard for tracking data in ESG. On the easy side, you have binary data points. Do you have an HR policy for X, etc.? Do you have X role in place, right? So it's binary, so that's easy. moving a little bit down further up the spectrum, it's things like, DNI, board diversity, CXO level diversity, things that are easier to track. Diversity in the workforce gets a little bit harder, especially if you're fragmented. You need to kind of centralize all your HR systems. Things like pay gap, male female pay gap, something you kind of stitch together. Data sets, HR data sets in order to assess. And then you get towards some of the more hard things to track on the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 carbon emissions. How do you actually track how do you actually track some of that stuff, especially when you get to the 2 or 3 emissions for some of these companies. So it's really a spectrum of complexity when you think about ESG. Usually, so we're partnering with some, this is where kind of providers, there's companies that specialize in emissions tracking that you can use to audit. So this is where companies like that can be very helpful. They can collect data and, miles traveled for business travel and who your value chain partners are, and they could kind of calculate your emissions. So working with knowledgeable third parties on some of the more, the harder stuff to track. It's how to play on that side.
Nitin, from your perspective as an LP, how do you think about ESG, data-driven ESG?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, it's a very complex field that you were mentioning. ESG is evolving quite a lot. And, in Europe, obviously, we have a lot of European LPs, and so we have a big operation, obviously, in Europe as well. That's half of our firm. It's evolving pretty rapidly, right? Where European GPs tend to be a little bit further ahead, just because there's been a greater focus around ESG, and you have to be, UNPRI signatory. So we've done that, but many GPs in the US are starting to talk more and more about ESG. And I think it's great. Obviously, they have great pitch books now, and it looks great of all the things they're doing. But, we're now starting to dig a little bit deeper into that. And what Nick was saying, what metrics are you actually gathering from the underlying portfolio companies, right? What KPIs are you monitoring on every board meeting and on a quarterly basis to see that you're really progressing along that spectrum, right? Of making sure that the portfolio is very ESG compliant, and you're sort of helping add value there. And I think so it is, so we are now having all of our GPs really fill out surveys for us, right? That we have put together. We're using a platform for that, and that really help us gather the data and to really rate GPs. And it allows us to better see which GPs are actually doing what they're saying they're doing to their portfolio companies in terms of ESG initiatives, and which ones are, on different paths to it, right? There's no right or wrong answer. It's just that some GPs are further along versus others. But I think as a whole, the more data there is, the more KPIs you start to monitor, it really helps the LPs, from our perspective, really figure out, GPs that are better at this and which really fit the portfolio better for us. Because ESG is becoming extremely relevant, and it's only going to get more and more as we go forward.
Great. Now, maybe to close it out, I'd love to get everyone's perspective. Obviously, we're sitting here somewhere near the end of the pandemic, or depending on where you are, we passed it a long time ago, or we're still in it. But regardless, we're clearly shifting to some version of a new normal. How's it been navigating the pandemic, being a data-driven organization, and what do you think the opportunities are coming out of it? Michael, if you'd like to kick us off on that.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I built the company inside the pandemic, so we have a unique view of how the world looks. Really seeing the sports industry, some opportunities in the sports industry was the impetus of the business. But literally, right as we were launching it a couple of years ago, the pandemic hit, which actually made our thesis even more interesting because of the depression of the sports industry, and some of the opportunities that we were going to go out and acquire actually had better prices and better cost basis for us as a build. So it actually plussed up, interestingly enough, and made us more aggressive in our approach to our business strategy, which is interesting. because, you know, the line I like to say, and, you know, I use this with a lot of our partners, but, you know, pandemics are temporary and sports are forever. So at the end of the day, you know, let's invest more and let's go quicker. So, so we've had fun building, but the toughest thing is inside of a business like ours, to be honest, is when you're putting a bunch of business together, culture is always the hardest thing. So we focus a lot on building culture, but not only that, putting companies together and actually doing it when nobody's in the office is doubly hard. So we're really, you know, we've really put a lot of focus on culture, actually using digital tools in that. You know, obviously we're on a sort of a video conference type call here right now, but using tools, digital tools. One of the things that's been most successful for us is actually using Slack and converting a bunch of our conversations over from traditional email to Slack and digital communication type community-based models where you can join and commune around certain topics, and Slack's a really good tool for that. So we found that just internally, as we built the company inside the pandemic, there's a lot of really interesting digital tools to use to keep everybody connected. We've done a lot of times we've done team building using digital platforms like trivia games and other things that we can do across the world, really, for all of our people that sit around and build a team. And we brought in a bunch of facilitators to do digital projects for us across our team all over the country and the world. So we really feel like using digital to try to build community and culture as we build the company is important. And then in terms of our actual products that we sell and our business, digital has become that much more important throughout the pandemic because people weren't able to go to the stadium. So if you're not able to go to the stadium, that means you're going to be interacting through your TV screen and through your phone with your favorite sports affiliations. And that actually amped up our ability to drive more value for our partners via those vehicles, TV and digital, which gave us, sort of a leg up as the world was converting more to digital experiences in the sports industry. We kind of got this boost during the pandemic, and we were sort of the activator during that time period. So we got some leadership in that space at that time as well.
Great. Well, I'm a Georgetown alum, and I don't know if you pay attention to our team. We just went over 20 in the Big East, so maybe you can share some data about how I can be happy about that.
Yeah, Georgetown's one of our partners, and I got to meet Coach Ewing, and I thought he would be mean to me just based on his persona, but he was very nice. So.
Yeah. Lee?
Sure. So obviously we're in the death care space. It's been an interesting ride during the pandemic for many, many reasons. I think the biggest learning that we've had and the most interesting, I guess, transformation has just been the comfort with technology in this space, both by the consumers and the families that we serve, as well as by those serving those families. So if we think about in general, frequent use case services drive consumer behavior and expectations, right? You use Amazon on a daily basis, Instacart on a weekly basis, and the technology that those companies put forth in front of you is going to drive how you expect non-frequent use case companies to service you, whether it's buying a car that you're doing once every 7 years or planning a funeral, which you do once or twice in your life. And what we saw the pandemic do is really accelerate that expectation. Our families expect for us to be able to service them over video. They expect for us to have virtual funeral options that they can purchase. They expect for us to have obituaries that are on the internet and not just in newspapers. So it's really driven this shift in consumer expectations that happened so extremely quickly, especially for an industry that never thought it would get here. So that I think has been the most interesting. From a company management perspective, I'm completely aligned with what Michael said. We have built this team over the last 2 years all over the US. And so how do we navigate that? Using more technology like this, like videos from management to the rest of our employees. We have 1,800 employees now throughout the country. So how do you keep in touch with them? I think that's also been a big paradigm shift.
Nitin, as the LP?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously the pandemic has brought a lot of changes to everyone. I think, as an LP, looking at it from our side, I mean, private equity industry sort of took a bit of a slowdown in Q2, but then it's been on a tear since then, right? With a number of fundraisings and number of deals. And I think technology has been really, really helpful in terms of us continuing to deploy capital in that time frame. Many times because we couldn't really go see the companies or see the funds in person. And I think that's sort of here to stay, right? I mean, we've sort of all gone back to work and meeting people again, but I think technology has made diligence so much more efficient, and it's allowed more of our team members to be engaged, right? Before, maybe one or two people will go out and meet with the GP or go to the company. Now everyone can participate in that. And it's made, you know, many more meetings, right? It's created a different type of relationship because you're seeing them more often on Zoom, right? But you're seeing people more often, and you're able to really dig in deeper into some of the GPs and the companies. So I think, you know, some of these changes are here to stay. But I think at the same time, because of these crises, a lot of our LPs are looking for answers faster, right? They're asking us what's happening now, and we want to know tomorrow what's happening, right? Can you project the impact? And I think so some of those demands are actually, you know, leading us and others to really utilize technology more and more into their operations to be able to service our clients better and to be really on top of things that are going on.
And bring us home, Nick.
Yeah, no, I mean, echo everything, agree with everything that the other panelists have said. I mean, on the change management side, I think we said it earlier, one of the most important things for digital transformation is adoption and change management. And the pandemic has really accelerated that change management side. You know, if people are comfortable going to the SharePoint or Dropbox to find files, or comfortable at, you know, looking at the CRM system for contact information versus, you know, shouting across the room at the associate to send you the model for the 5th time in a row. Like, people are comfortable using these digital tools. You know, often we're, you know, it's sitting when we're in a flex model. So when you're sitting back at work, you're in the same room physically with other people. You jump on a call, everyone goes to opposite ends of the buildings to jump on the same teams together. So other people who are remote can also sign it. So just using these, just the adoption, how adoption is accelerated, these digital tools really improve kind of ways of working efficiently. And then second, couldn't agree more with what Lee said on the opportunity side. Customer expectations are increasing, especially a lot in the middle market where we operate, and especially in Access, we operate in essential services. Very traditional, typically traditional type of businesses where, you know, you think of something like retail or media that has been completely transformed by digital. Well, the type of customer expectations that has been set in those industries is now starting to flow in traditional businesses, right? Like if I could buy something on Uber Eats and track it in real time to my house, how come, you know, when I'm installing a fire security system for my business, that they give me a 3-week delivery window, installation window, right? So I think from a GP's perspective, digital value creation levers are increasingly going to become important when we think about potential value in the spaces that we play, especially in these traditional industries that aren't as digitized, but, you know, you could easily apply these proven but underutilized technologies that have transformed other industries into our space. So it's an exciting opportunity going forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for sharing your insights today. It's been very enriching, and thank you for our audience for participating today.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Bye.
And great. Thank you, everyone.